So on this topic of resilience, maybe we could utilize your experience leading the supply chain stabilization task force for COVID-19 as a real world example. So could you take us into the situation you faced when you arrived at the White House? What are the challenges or problems that you face, and what was your mission?
So we didn't make anything, so to speak, in America. And hospitals didn't have any inventory to rely on. The medical distributors had some inventory because they were relying on overseas shipments, and there's a life cycle to sail time from Asia. But really, that system, as I said, was very linear, just in time, and didn't have echelons of supply. And really, and this is not this is apolitical and not about any administration. The national stockpile was never really designed for a 50 state, 6 territory, long-term pandemic. It had some supplies in it. But if you can remember back here to the left, 9/11, anthrax, we had all these anthrax letters and things. So it was a chem bio, like, hey, we need the ability to have something in reserve to help a selected region. And so this national stockpile was never a pandemic stockpile. And that fact has never really been put out. So there was not a holistic government, federal government thought about how to manage a medical industrial base for a pandemic. So if you go back to the pandemic plan that previous administrations had helped write, and you read them, yeah, those plans knew you were going to need gobs of stuff, but then it didn't have the levels of details into it to then go execute, and who was going to be responsible for the gobs of stuff. And so as I walked into the stand up a task force, right, the national stockpile had been given out, like delivered pro rata share by population to 50 states and 6 territories. There were no surge contracts. So Health and Human Services or anybody had not had, think about everything. If you think back to March of 2020, what did you see on your TV? You saw CNN, MSNBC News, everybody. Doctors they didn't have N95 masks. They didn't have a severe shortage of supplies. And so there was no contracts in place to say, okay, we're gonna surge that. I could not believe that we just had some boxes to stuff on the shelf and then nothing afterwards. We had no U.S. industrial base to surge from. It wasn't like I could just go to, well, we did a little bit. We went to 3M and said, make more N95 masks. The government did not have a significant public-private partnership with industry for pandemic supplies. Health and Human Services had no expertise. They did not have people in supply chain. They did not have people in logistics, and they certainly did not have anybody like the Department of Defense had that managed a defense industrial base, because nobody cares more about nuclear aircraft carriers than the Navy does, and how the nation needs to keep technologies and manufacturers in livelihood so we can deliver those things for the nation. Health and Human Services did not have that mindset in people managing a medical industrial base. And we certainly didn't have any thoughts about strategic suppliers and people in reserve. So it was, this is why I said it's hectic, this is exhausting, it was stressful, and yet it was unbelievable because I got to lead essentially the largest industrial mobilization and uses of the Defense Production Act since probably the Korean War. So that's the problem I stepped into. Go fix it.
Yeah, I think it all brought back those memories. I remember all of us watching, right, all the news channels and trying to figure out what's going on, what supply do we have, why do we have shortages, what's the next shipment, whatever that might be. And I still remember that until those daily briefing, right? Until I think you showed up as a supply chain expert, and you're able to actually tell us what exactly happened, how many was on order, what's coming. So that's where the first time that I saw a supply chain expert, in those daily briefing at the White House. How did you solve the problem? I mean, given all the complexity and lack of preparation that you just described, and in particular, right, what process, approach, and the methodology did you use?
It was essentially an elephant, right? How do you eat an elephant one piece at a time? I did have a little bit of help. There was a retired Army Special Forces colonel that had some medical background that was part of, there was a chief of staff at Health and Human Services. And he helped very quickly orientate to me. His name is Paul Mango, fabulous individual. I kind of say things like, thank God for Paul Mango. But he had been doing some thinking about this, and he was kind of like, hey, John, here's the state of play of the medical industrial base. And our reliance on other things. So he helped me kind of get up to speed. But what I took away from our conversations about the what's the problem we're trying to solve was time. That, like, you are not going to solve this. This was not going to be a light switch. This was going to be a rheostat. And I devised 4 lines of effort that get after the biding of time so I could get to the last line of effort. So the first line of effort was preservation. And this turned into what you hated and saw in the news. We were going to make our supplies go longer, last longer. And this ended up being reuse. This has ended up being the decontamination of N95 masks that nobody, the nurses, doctors, nobody liked. We even figured out how to put 2 people on a ventilator because we thought we were going to run out of ventilators, right? So there was a preservation line of effort, and we put some money in things, technology against that. Then there was an accelerate line of effort where we attempted to work around the globe to find sources of supply, buy it with federal dollars, and bring it here. I had one caveat to that, though. If it was a source of supply that was being purchased by a commercial entity to deliver to a hospital, or a state to deliver to a hospital, do not compete with that. Don't buy it out from under them. Find new sources of supply that may or may not be going to U.S. healthcare. Buy that and fly it here. That turned into Airbridge, where we did buy both federal product, and we helped the commercial marketplace who had dedicated sources of supply that they used maritime mode of shipping, where you just wasn't cost effective to stick a 20-cent mask on an airplane and fly it. But guess what? This was a pandemic, and I needed to prime the pump. I couldn't wait for 30 days, 38, 40 days to float it across from Asia. We put it on airplanes and flew it. That turned into Airbridge. The third line of effort was probably the thing that I'm probably most proud of, which got the least coverage, which was a data line of effort. You can't manage a supply chain unless you can see it and make sense of it. And so I fall back on my owning all the Navy business systems and knowing what ERPs can and cannot do, et cetera. And we managed to use the Defense Production Act, Title VII, to allow commercial industry to give me their transactional business daily information. And we started small. The gold standard was an N95 mask. Where are all the N95 masks, right? And so we added things onto that. So if you think about the 9 or 10 large medical distributors We hooked all of their ERP, we dumped all their ERP system into a cloud at FEMA, and then brought in a visualization tool on top of that. And by the second week of April, by probably around April 10th, we had visibility to what was in every warehouse in the commercial network, what was coming from manufacturing, their sources of supply, and what their orders were from every customer that they had. And mostly the customers I cared deeply about were hospitals and nursing homes. And so those 10 medical distributors provided product to about 95 to 98% of the hospital beds in America. So I was like, good enough for me. I don't need to know, like the next 2% was probably not worth it. And the same thing for nursing homes. They delivered to about 95% of all the beds in nursing homes in America. So by the second week of April, I had supply and essentially national demand. And then throughout the rest of the spring, we added a way for hospitals to give us visibility and nursing homes to give us visibility of their supplies on hand and be able to forecast when one hospital system may be running out of supplies. And so then we could take state, federal, commercial product and go feed the hungry, so to speak. So there was a data line there. There was a data line of effort where, unfortunately, in the beginning, I was managing scarcity, but in the end, we were making sure that everybody had the ability to get the products they needed. And that started small N95 masks, and then it ended up having essentially anything that you needed for a pandemic and all the drugs and pharmaceuticals to go with it. The final line of effort in that is this expansion line of effort where it was, how do we make these things in America? How do we get so we can have more of it and not be reliant on overseas sources, and use the Defense Production Act to expand U.S. production, whether it be an N95 mask, whether it be needles and syringes for the vaccine, whether it be, and try to figure out how to get everybody a test kit and a swab to test themselves, right? So there was just a massive effort to expand the U.S. industrial base. A very long answer to how did you organize for this? We had a multi-agency task force at FEMA at first, and then over in Health and Human Services that had people from Commerce, Treasury, Office of Management and Budget, FDA, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. I mean, you just name it. Every agency in the federal government had somebody on my task force.
Yeah, wow. This is, if I were thinking about a major takeaway for me from this 4 steps, right? You basically find a way to remove the constraint of time, and you expedite the speed. And then you also brought the visibility, right, to both supply and demand, as well as a production in the US. So that gave us a lot more control over for the longer period of time. That's fantastic. Within a shorter period of time, you did find a very effective way to manage that. So John, from your experience, how would you define supply chain resilience?
There's certainly textbook versions. People use words like ability to withstand shocks, those type of things. I think about it as, certainly resiliency, the capability to recover quickly. When I think about where we were on, I'll just say the 16th of March when I showed up at Health and Human Services, we had no ability to recover, certainly not quickly. It's got to have something in there about design not to break. I think about a very naval aspect. You're only strong as this weakest link in your chain. And we had a lot of weak links. I have that vision in my head about all of the different pieces that have to happen. Manufacturing, distribution, transportation, right? And almost every piece of that broke.
Mhm. Yeah. So I thought it was interesting. I'm going to share this definition from the White House fact sheet in terms of resiliency. This is what they say: the ability to recover from an unexpected shock. It requires visibility, agility, and redundancy.